you post this, it will be a delayed Instagram live, a belated Instagram live. But today, we have Maude, the translator of The Naked Woman, here. And so I feel like we can just start off by reading a little bit of the beginning so you can get a sense especially of the language, which is phenomenal, but also kind of needs to be heard or read to be understood. Talk.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
This is a fantastically happy office. I can assure you that that's not always true of publishers, so it's a real pleasure to be here. Okay, the beginning of The Naked Woman. As much as she'd been hoping otherwise, Rebecca Link's 30th birthday began with exactly what she had expected: nothing. What if nothing happens, she asked herself. I don't care if it's good or bad, so long as it's something. Her mistake had been to invest her hopes in a crucial event occurring at an arbitrary point in time, when what needed to happen would inevitably be a flash in the dark, an unexpected ambush that catches you unawares during an otherwise ordinary situation. But then the fateful day came, just a dull summer yawn, as unremarkable as any other. Rebecca looked at it over her shoulder in the mirror. A beautiful day behind a beautiful face, both lacking the qualities that make things memorable. It all began with a subconscious withdrawal from her ordinary life, a disappearance. Perhaps the moment of revelation, when something truly unique happens in our lives, had finally come for her. If it occurs at a wake, this event consists of being full of life next to someone who will never move again. And if it marks the passing of yet another year, the kind involving a dangerously round number, it is the opportunity to finally decide what to do with the rest of your life. The cottage at which Rebecca arrived at midnight seemed to be suspended in space. She hadn't got to know it yet. All she knew was what was in plain sight, a large field stretching out in front of her, abruptly interrupted by the dark silhouette of a sea creature. Right from the start, she thought that the forest looked like a beach whale. On the windy day she first saw it, it had been possessed by a kind of madness, like certain kinds of repressed human anger. The forest moved without moving, exhaling noisy, portentous gusts of wind, rooted to the spot in twitchy bondage. Then it would be still for a time, its indomitable mass breathing quietly. To the right, the leafy barrier didn't quite reach the river. The river had no name, at least not one she knew, and ran along the forest, separated by a mysteriously clear strip of what was perhaps leaves or sand, something the colour of her own personal void. But there was more to the incredible landscape she had acquired upon buying the cottage for next to nothing. It was something less tangible, like the ability to escape at any moment by train. This is what had happened the night before when, watched in amazement by her fellow passengers, she had stepped off the train into the solitary locale, a stop in the middle of a field before the next station. She had been told it was a special privilege granted to the owner of the cottage. Well, if there was a reason for this odd addendum to her property rights, at that moment she wasn't interested in what it could be. She simply cut across the field lit by a complicit moon and slipped into the house, completely shorn of any ties to the past, feeling like she were entering a primitive womb from which she would only return once supremely well prepared. Rebecca Link let the coat covering her nudity fall to the floor. She lay on the bed and observed the moonlight filtering through the shutters. The black and white stripes made everything uniform. Several times she tried to close her eyes and slip between the bars, but they were waiting for her behind her eyelids. She became lost in a hypnotic dream, a dream that carried her back along the same rails as those used by the train that had stopped for her alone. Again she heard the insistent voice that had been badgering her since the beginning of her trip. "Excuse me, madam, can I see your ticket?" The man's heavy voice founders along the long, solid rows of seats. Trees line the road. Another train passes in the opposite direction. After a long flight through the night, the stations come. People get on and off, stealing each other's places. "Haven't you found it yet?" The man's voice upon her again. "But you'll never find it." Then come the fences, taut, stretched wires, a monotonous hum. She tries to remember the title of the book on her nightstand and has to stammer, interrupted by the voice, which no longer comes from the man, but the fences. "Allow me to look for it myself, madam. The ticket must be in your pocket, maybe next to your keys." This time the words sounded remote. The man had uttered them from among the far-off, trembling wires, as if through water, tangled in the violin strings vibrating in the static beyond life. "Oh, thank you," she said sweetly. "One always forgets the little things. Always forgets, always forgets." Monotonous hum. The man's fingers wanted to take the music away from her. The key, the ticket, the fences. They pass over an iron bridge. The sound echoes in the chasm below. Someone cast into the void calls out sadly, "Madam, I don't want to interrupt your journey, but when someone sees trouble coming, they should let others know. Offer fair warning." The last thing the little man will ever say. She would have liked to go back and jump out to find him, but the black and white stripes took her somewhere else, leaving her exhausted. One always forgets the little things was the last thing she could remember. Always forgets. And yet, before passing out, she managed to remember other details. For example, inside the book on her nightstand, there was a small dagger, a work of art, just right for beheading a woman imprisoned in irritating parallel bars like these. They were keeping her from finding herself. The grasping hand won't make it. It knocks a glass of water off the table and sits there like a frozen flower. But then the dagger shows that it can reach her on its own. It moves, attracted to her fingertips, and, of course, to her hand, which is attached to an arm, which in turn belongs to a body with a head and a neck. A head, such an important part of the body on top of something as fragile as a neck. Although the arm was limp and the hand fingerless, the blade penetrated easily. It came across countless things that might have been called arteries, veins, cartilage, or warm, viscous blood. Everything except for pain. By then, pain no longer existed. The head rolled heavily, like a fruit. Rebecca Link watched it fall impassively, feeling neither joy nor sorrow.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
This is your, now I guess, fourth time reading it for?
Fourth, yeah. I'm not sure I'm getting any
Yeah.
better at it.
I think you are. I
Okay.
mean, do you feel less nervous?
I'm more familiar with the words.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's fun to read her.
Yeah.
She has a lovely rhythm to her writing.
Well, could you talk a little bit about, so Armenia Summers is deceased, she died in 1991, I believe?
94.
94. Could you talk a little bit about how you came across her work?
Well, I was looking for books that people might be interested in translating, and I asked an editor what there was a lack of in the market, for want of a better word, and I was told that there were very few Latin American women writers who fell into a kind of modern classic category. They'd been more or less often have been overshadowed by say the boom writers or other or for other reasons. And so I asked various writers and academics who was good essentially, and Armenia's name kept coming up. So I went to the bookstore and picked up the book with the most eye-catching title, which was The Naked Woman.
Okay.
And it looked slim and thus easy, and it turned out not to be that at all. But it was certainly unique reading it, and yeah. So that's how that came about. And the more I read of her, the more I liked her, and the more I thought this would really be a nightmare to translate, but it's something that really ought to be done.
Did the bookstore have other books by the same author? This was the best
she's
title? Not the best
for the
title.
first time pretty much ever I mean it's not her career anymore because she's passed away,
Right.
but all her books are in print. That never happened in her lifetime.
Interesting.
And it only happened because there was this one editor managed to persuade the estate to release the rights where others had failed, because she'd done a very writerly thing when she died of saying, burn all my stuff. And that was for unpublished novels and papers and things, but the estate had if they hadn't, she didn't follow the instructions to the letter, but they did sort of keep a very tight rein on everything as per the instructions on the deathbed. But eventually they were persuaded.
So how does this book, I guess, fit in with the rest of her career? Like, is it
Well,
like how was it considered? Okay.
It was it was very much a first novel, and it's very much in the sense of many first novels, and that she talks about a lot of things that have clearly been important to her through her whole life, and she's also trying to make like a statement,
Right.
And to establish a style, and I think she does all these things very well. She certainly sounded like no one else, but she also knew that what she was writing about was so controversial for the time that she invented this pseudonym for Armenia Summers. Isn't her real name. It's Armenia Echeverria. No, it's not. It's Echegoy, something like that. And there are various other names too. It's quite a long one. But this is she sort of invented this character, this writer called Armenia Summers,
Did she ever, I guess, leave the pseudonym behind in her lifetime?
She was always sort of two people. She was a writer called Harmonia Summers, and then she used her real name in her other line of work, which was she was kind of she was very big in education in Uruguay, and she had various different governmental roles, and she worked. She campaigned for improving education in prisons, for example, for improving education generally. I mean, there's a very good afterword in here, in which Elena mentions that when she's asked for an interview, she would say, "Do you want to interview the educator or the writer?" And the venue for the interview would be different depending on that. The writer interviewed at home, and the educator at her offices.
I see.
So she was very, very consciously constructing a certain persona.
Yeah, it's interesting that like she clearly had a maybe more public, like political part of her life as well, like when she was campaigning for education reform and things like that. But it's interesting because I think that while even as the feminist press, but mostly as feminist readers in 2018, like it's easy to have a slightly political reading of the book, but it's also not like hit you over the head, like capital F, manifesto at all. It's a very weird literary book. It's a very beautiful book.
No, the political statement is the character and what she does, not what she says or what the book says.
Right. But I think even her language is kind of subversive in that it's like very funny, and I think sometimes it takes on this persona, but then it subverts itself in terms of how fallible it is. So I guess I was just wondering, like, how was that process, like translating this very particular sly and also fantastic voice?
Yeah, I mean that's the bit that I love most about her. That was what when I really got into it, when I realized how funny a writer she is. So I wanted to, I don't know how successful I was, but I wanted to very much make sure that came out in the translation, because obviously a lot of weird things happen, and there's a lot of there's a lot of poetry to it too, but it's a kind of an amused poetry,
right?
And that was a hard balance to strike. I hope I've come somewhere close to it.
Well, I think there's something like when someone seems to be saying something really graphic or intense in kind of almost like a dull or monotonous way, there's something always sort of inherently funny, or at least that's how I read
absolutely,
it. Like, right? Like it's funny.
Like the deadpan stuff. Like the last thing I read, the head rolled heavily like a fruit. I think that's really funny. But there's a nice sort of, there's a poetry. It's really, that's how a head would roll. Right. If one were to cut it off their own
head.
Their own neck, yeah. But that kind of, there's all, the book is full of moments like that you could, where she's being both subversive and just lyrical at the same time.
Yeah, well, I have actually some previously gathered audience questions.
I like it.
Then someone's about translation. Oh, okay. How do you think, well, the book has been out now, I guess, for a couple weeks, and we've talked a little bit, we've read some reviews, but I guess even during the translation process, how did you think Armonia Summers' work would read to English-speaking, or more specifically, American readers? I mean, the hope, of course, is that they like it, but I don't know, did you think about that kind of, jump, both in time and space, and how that might be perceived?
I did. I think that's because my background before I became a translator was in publishing. So I've seen, and it was even in publishing translated books. So I've seen where really great books can be ruined by a poor translation, but also by one that hasn't really taken its audience into account. So I was hoping, I mean, because it was what I liked most myself about her book, I wanted to emphasize the humor as well as the sort of weirdness and the lyricism. I thought it was important to convey that she was a knowing writer, that there was something she was consciously doing with this book, and one of those things was to kind of make you laugh, but also to make you laugh to make you think. That's a horrible cliche. that kind of idea. And in terms of an audience, I was hoping that readers of, say, Joy Williams or Lydia Davis would pick up this book and really enjoy it. That was sort of what I was hoping for. I mean, the first thing I translated by her was actually I started translating this beforehand, but got published in English was The Fork in the Rails, which got published in Sweeney's number 51, and that was the kind of audience I had in mind. The people who were interested in sort of fiction that was out there, but would also be recognisable.
Right. Is there anything about the reception that has surprised you?
Only that how excited people are by it, because it does seem to strike a chord in the way that it's a book that was published in 1950 in Uruguay,
right,
and that by a writer who is utterly unknown in English, and I'm surprised by quite how willing people are to pick it up and read it, and the people I've spoken to really seem to enjoy, which is nice, which is great.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, and maybe this has to do, I guess, with this kind of surreal element, but it's a world very unfamiliar, obviously 70 years ago in Uruguay, and also very, very familiar. Like, even in the first part that you read is sort of about sort of this banal, like, everyday middle-class existence. You wake up, you realize you're 30, and nothing's changed, even though everything is supposed to change, which I think is even the premise of, like, you know, many rom-com blockbusters that have come out this year. You know, like this kind of like how do
Absolutely,
you,
yeah.
Yeah, and then sometimes it's the entry point to, I guess, this romantic comedy, and sometimes into this existential, like, I don't know, look at brutality.
A very weird romantic comedy. That's an angle I hadn't thought of, but it's a good one. One of the at one of the events, Nina, who in Boston, said she thought this was a love story.
Interesting. I'm
not sure she's right, but there's definitely something there. You can make the argument to say that the naked woman is looking for love, and she sort of finds it, sort of. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely.
Huh. Yeah. Interesting. And she meant a love story between two human characters in the book, like Armonia and the. Okay.
Yeah, or two.
Not like
or
in
two
like a kind of bigger, like, you know, the naked woman and the earth, or you know, nothing like that. Yeah.
No, nothing too hippie.
Okay.
No, and she's looking for some kind of culmination, but she between, if not the two characters, between a kind of a pair of archetypes, and she
right.
And the men she meets in this book, the first thing she's doing is sort of essentially assessing them for whether they can be that person,
right.
And inevitably they come up short, right. But yeah, no, that's fun, and there's something, certainly Armonia was there was sort of a mocking way she was writing that. She was making fun of men in various different ways in that sense.
Cool, I'm going to read it. Burning question. Okay, well, so this is burning question. What are you working on next?
Hopefully more novels by Armonia, by Armonia Summers. There's a bunch of women writers who really haven't, from say the second half of the 20th century, so there's a few from before, who I think that English language readers would really enjoy reading, and who haven't received nearly enough attention so far.
Oh yeah, well, so you mentioned that's what that editor you spoke to in publishing said.
Yeah.
When was this? Do you feel like they would adjust what they were saying now? I don't know if it's really
well, I think
huge change.
I think that's certainly in the time. Say this was 6 years ago when I first had that conversation, when this all first began. Certainly you couldn't say that there's a dearth of contemporary Latin American writers being published, women writers especially, being published now. But you're still not seeing many translations of generations that came beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in part that's, I mean, in part, I think that is beginning to change now because those writers who are writing now are talking about these women who inspired them beforehand, and
Right,
or
so
they're just discovering them now too,
Mm-hmm.
in their home countries, and now because they're getting international attention, so they're
Right.
promoting these writers.
Yeah.
In that sense.
That's really awesome. Okay, well, usually we recap this by saying here are these XY events that are going to come forward, but you've already done your events. You've already done your US book tour.
If you're ever in Buenos Aires, look me up. I can chat about Armenia forever.
But hopefully we'll be talking about this book and this author for a long time to come, not just the two of us, but also, I don't know, other readers. And
so,
and I agree. I think we've had such a good, satisfyingly warm reception to the book so far. So
yeah.
hopefully more to come. Yeah, thank you. I don't know.